to this episode of Pause with Nandini. Today I have Audrey Truschke with me, who is a historian, author, and activist. She's a professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University in New York, New Jersey. She is the author of two award winning books: Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth. Her latest book, India 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent, is coming soon, and I'm really excited to talk about the book and talk about all the other work that she's been involved in. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Nandini, for having me and for that very kind introduction.
Absolutely. There is so much to cover because obviously your work spans at least 5,000 years. I did want to start with just thinking about the role of a historian. And I asked this question in the context of this whole revisionist movement where stories of the past are obviously being reimagined to suit certain narratives, whether it's the Hindutva movement or whether it's a global sort of ethno-nationalistic rise in the way people are imagining and reimagining and retelling their stories. What then is the historian's charge, in your opinion? And what do you consider your personal sort of passion in the work that you do?
That's a great set of questions. So let me begin by saying I think historians we're very strange creatures in comparison to most in the modern world, and that's by design. My goal, let me speak for myself. My goal as a historian is to accurately reconstruct the past to the extent possible, and then to explain it in ways that are relevant and compelling in the present day. So it's not that contemporary times don't matter. They do. When we tell history, when I was writing this book that comes out in June, I'm thinking about modern times. I'm thinking about modern readers. But fundamentally, my obligation is to the people of the past. This is something I write about in the book, the India 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent. I think I put it in a postscript somewhere when I talk a little bit about theory. And I talk about, among other things, empathy. Empathy is critical for a historian because, history, it's fundamentally the study of change over time, but usually not like geological change, usually human change, right? Like we are telling human stories of what humans have built and destroyed and experienced, the joy, the pain, the suffering, all of it. And you have to have empathy to do that. Empathy with not only the people of the present, and I do go in the book till about 2020, so I do go through history that is very much within my lifetime and for other people's living memory as well, but also with people of the past, right? And the dead can't really speak for themselves, and so the historian is in this interesting place. We're trying to speak not so much for those who are gone and generations who are no longer with us, right? We don't want to put words in their mouth, but we do want to speak about them and enliven their stories. And so I spent a lot of time when I was writing this book, thinking about that. And what does it mean to have empathy with people in the past, especially when I know that their stories will upset people in the present? I decided my obligation ultimately is to the unvarnished truth. And that is how I honor the people of the past and the people of the present. I tell the stories of the past to my contemporaries today without whitewashing, without soft pedaling, right? I tell it in its full glory and its full horror as well. So there's a lot of terrible stuff in history. So we sort of do it all. That's where I see myself coming in. In terms of my personal stance, it's not a subject most historians love to talk about. I'm with that camp because I think we strive towards objectivity. Okay, objectivity doesn't really exist, like full objectivity, but I still consider it a useful thing to strive for. The fact that we all exist in a moment in history, and so we all are subjective and identity matters, that's all true. But that doesn't mean we should just sort of abandon and give up to that. Like it's all subjective, it's all the same. That is not my view at all. I believe we should strive towards objectivity. So to me, I'm not part of the narrative that I tell in this book. That said, I do include, I think at the very end is sort of an acknowledgements section, just a little bit about my background and how I came to study all of this, because folks are intrinsically interested in that. And I note, in brief, I began with the study of Sanskrit. That's where this all began at the age of 18 at the University of Chicago. That probably sounds really strange. Like, why would an 18-year-old college student in the American Midwest be studying Sanskrit? I do plead that the University of Chicago is a bizarre and intellectual place. That seemed really normal. I was interested. Anyways, Sanskrit's an amazing language. I fell in love with it, not in an emotive sense, but in an intellectual sense. I studied it for years. I worked on early Hinduism. I then went to graduate school. At some point, 12, 15 years have gone by. I have a PhD. Like, what am I going to do? Go run a corporation in America? Like, absolutely not, right? So I become a professor. Long story short, the study of pre-modern South Asia has defined my entire adult life. It has consumed my professional interest, and it remains my deepest and most abiding intellectual love, which for me, I mean, that's the greatest praise, is what excites my mind. And I'm deeply invested in telling South Asian history, not for any modern sort of agenda of my own, but because I actually care about the past. And I know that sounds really strange, but as I said, historians are kind of strange creatures.
That's a lovely introduction. You say in this book that this book you offer a new history crafted to be relevant in the 21st century while avoiding a perspective warped by contemporary ideas. So I'm glad that you unpacked that a little bit in terms of sort of understanding that you are in a place in time in history, and at the same time, looking back with empathy and trying to see the full humanity of the people who've passed in their lives. So that makes a lot of sense. What I also found interesting is that, now when we speak of India, especially through this sort of ethno-nationalistic lens, there seems to be a continuity of India that goes back millennia. Whereas you say that India was more a cluster of regions than a unified whole. We're talking about early parts of how it all came together. And I found the reference to the Panchatantra quite interesting, the way you say that, it's a cluster of stories. And there is a thin thread that goes through all of it, but you're not trying to come up with one overarching sort of conveniently boxed story that tells or contains everything. There are independent multitudes, and each of them have their own little world and their own universe. I know it's a big ask, but are you able to trace for us some key points or key milestones in this journey?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I can try. So let me begin. You sort of hinted at it, Nandini, but I think this is an important point. In 2025, when most of us say the word India, we mean the modern nation state. That's totally fair in 2025. But for a book that, for 4,900 plus years of the history it covers, there was no Indian nation state. India in the title and in the vast majority of the book does not refer to the modern nation state. It refers to the Indian subcontinent. So the land area that is currently occupied by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as contested areas between various of those nations. I know that can be sort of, can throw people off a little bit, right? And it throws people off at the very beginning, right? I mean, one of the earliest things I say in the book is like, forget about India as a nation state for a while. Like, it's going to be a long time before we get there. India is this larger area. There is no political unity in pre-modern India. Right? No one ever rules the entire subcontinent. And to the extent that that throws people off, that is a benefit to me. Right? It's not by design. It's just the language. I'm working with the language that we have. But it is a benefit because studying the past, I mean, it's walking through the halls of times and places that are radically different than our own. And that can be so hard to imagine. Right? There's foundational features of our modern world that it's so easy to assume it's always been like that, right? And it hasn't. Right? Everything changes over time. So there's this huge disruption. In terms of sort of major milestones, I suppose I think about this in terms of what I chose to include in the book and what I chose to exclude. I excluded from the book the vast majority of South Asian history. I had to, right? South Asian history is one of the largest subjects within the study of history. I mean, this is a study of a quarter of the world's population and their history over time. The Indian subcontinent has been unusually densely populated in comparison to other areas of the world for a really long time because of rich and fertile land and things like that. This should be like a huge section at the bookstore, not one book. So I had to cut out a lot of stuff. And so when I think about what did I want to include, of course, I'm thinking about highlights, right? To me, the metrics for what I included, there were a couple of big ones. One, I needed a certain amount of evidence, right? If we only have one or two inscriptions, they hint at something, I think it might have been big, that's not enough, right, to make a full chapter out of. So I needed robust material and or textual evidence to really discuss a subject. Number two, I'm looking for big changes when new religions come on the scene, right? That includes religions like Buddhism. Probably everyone who opens this book, or most people, are already going to know that Buddhism has its origins in northern India. But it also includes people like the Ajivakas. Okay, a lot of people who open this book have never heard of the Ajivakas because they died out by the 13th century CE. Most of them probably died out before that. But they mattered too, right? They were around almost 2,000 years before they sort of kicked the bucket. So I'm thinking about big changes. I'm also thinking about sort of the different kinds of history we do, right? So you gave a very nice lineup of kind of major civilizational and political moments, right? So things like the Indus civilization or the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, and then things like British colonization, the Mughals, so on and so forth. I cover stuff like that, but I also try to include other things: religious history, social history. I include a bit of fashion history, something that one thing that survives are beads. So we often know like the jewelry people wore when we don't know anything else about them. We don't know what they spoke or what they did, but like we know what the necklace looks like, right? This stuff matters. It matters today, right? Most people today still wear jewelry of some sort. We're still on that train. And so these are the sorts of things I'm looking for. It ends up being a very disconnected story, right? Because it's not really a story, right? There is no, as you pointed out, there's no singular plot line that runs throughout. And this is something I'll just flag for folks. There's a lot of books on South Asian history by historians, and there's a lot of books on South Asian history by non-historians that they get it wrong and they're approaching it with this strong ideology. One way to tell the difference between the two is who claims to offer a singular storyline. Anytime someone says there's some sort of like single thing, this is how we can see the history of thousands of years of South Asia, big red flag. Okay, that's not going to work. All right, and so I trace a bunch of different things. I'll point out one early disconnect. So the first chapter of the book concerns the Indus civilization, which is, centered in what's now Pakistan, largely around the Indus River, also around the Ghaggar-Hakra River, which no longer exists. So that's people forget that a lot because the river's not there anymore. And so this is a story it's an indigenous civilization. It's a story that we tell with material evidence. We have no written text from the Indus civilization. We have short bits of writing that we can't read and probably never will be able to, right? We're nowhere close to cracking that script. That happens. It all falls apart. Then a few hundred years go by. Then the next chapter 2 of the book, concerns what is usually known as the Aryan migrations and then the Vedic culture that they set up. I do avoid the word Aryan in the book. For Indian readers, as I said, the book, if I didn't mention, the book will be published in India simultaneously. So for Indian readers, avoiding the word Aryan may seem a little odd and just unnecessary. I would remind those folks in the West, the word Aryan really has 20th century German connotations, so that's problematic. That's why I avoid the term to avoid confusion there. In any case, so then chapter 2 is about Vedic culture, right? And then the folks, I call them Vedic migrants. to avoid the term. And this is a totally different story. There's no material evidence, right? We have no material evidence we can conclusively match with early Vedic communities. It's entirely based on the Vedas, on texts that even originally were not, I mean, they weren't written, but they're still text orally recited and remembered. And this is a story about people coming into South Asia and then integrating, intermarrying, right? They become a South Asian culture relatively quickly, although originally coming from the outside. It's a totally different story. The two have nothing to do with each other. As far as we can tell, the Vedic or Aryan migrants, they're not even aware of the Indus civilization. This is ancient history by the time they set foot on the subcontinent. And so you have these disconnects throughout. I do what I can with it. I do offer a series of recurring themes throughout the book. And in lieu of a singular storyline, which I cannot responsibly impose on the history of South Asia, I do point out some things that come up again and again. Social stratification, climate change, large-scale political formations, especially a little bit later, right? You know, we have the Cholas in the south, we have Vijayanagara, we have the Mughals in the north. You know, there's something to be said there. I also offer migration as a consistent in South Asian history, and that's something that is likely to sit a little uneasy in the modern politics of South Asia, but that's not really my problem. And, you know, to me, I'd put a positive spin on it. The bottom line is India was the place to be in pre-modernity, right? People looked to India and they saw wealth, they saw opportunity, they saw a world that was ready for them to enter. And this is people, you know, who are coming from the north, from the east, from the west. A ton of different groups come at discrete times and from discrete places into different parts of South Asia and integrate and become part of South Asian history. And I do think that tracing those migrations that offers one way to sort of see at least something that pops up again and again.
No, absolutely. It's very interesting because the brain wants to find unifying themes, and that's why you have to do a little bit of mental work to be like, right, you know, it's not always going to be so easy to decipher, and especially when you're talking about, you know, so many ancient civilizations that haven't really left as much evidence as you said that you like to go on evidence. And if the evidence isn't there, you do say somewhere that beautiful stories are the work of fiction. So, you know, if you're looking for fact, then you come to a historian. Um, Tell me the ways in which you have attempted to address two issues which you've pointed out in the telling of historical work, which is sexism and casteism. And you said that you found that as an area of lack, and you wanted to address those specifically in this book. You say your goal is to diversify the standard caste of South Asian history. And I noticed that you spoke about the Therigatha poems, which were written by the Buddhist nuns. And that was really interesting to read because when you think about the history of Buddhism, it's really the story of the Buddha and then of men who sort of carried on the tradition. So it's interesting that you've made a conscious decision to highlight stories that perhaps have gotten lost or not given the importance that they deserve. So tell me a little bit about that process.
Absolutely. So, you know, we continue to have so many problems and biases today, both as people in the world and as historians. And in my view, historians of South Asia, we do continue to suffer from sexism and casteism. That manifests in certain ways in the modern academy. Other scholars have written on that and are working on those issues. For me, I was focused in this book about how it has unfairly and unhelpfully shaped the stories we tell in the past, right? If you read standard overview books of South Asia, you know, going back more than 100 years, almost all of them pretty strong on telling you about the origins of Sanskrit, about the origins of the Vedas, about Brahminical culture, Brahminical text. But how many really look at Dalit communities or Shudra communities and sort of how those developed? Similarly, men dominate the pages of history books. That's true for South Asian history, it's true for all other parts of the world history, as far as I know, as well. What I try to do in the book, I try to move the ball forward significantly on both fronts. I do not offer a full corrective. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. I hope that my book is surpassed by the next person who writes a overview history of South Asia, especially on this front, and that they include even more women and even more stories of lower castes. And so I do a couple of things. In terms of, let me talk about women first, then I'll do caste. In terms of women, so you mentioned the Therigatha. So I talk about the founding of Buddhism, and then I sort of faced a choice, right? So thinking about early Buddhist ideas, the most obvious place the scholars look is the Pali Canon, right? This tripartite collection of texts written in Pali, early Buddhist sources. I do quote from the Pali Canon, okay, for any of my ancient Buddhist colleagues that are listening. Okay, of course I quote from it. I mention it, I define it, actually refer to it several times. But in terms of an in-depth section, I was like, well, why not look at the Therigatha instead? This is the earliest collection of poems by women anywhere in the world, actually, earliest anthology. But also, this is an early collection of Buddhist poems. It's roughly the same time period as the early parts of the Pali Canon. So it's still offering that kind of early Buddhist perspective, but from a female point of view. And so I use those poems. Those poems also just work really well in the classroom. And I wrote this book for anyone who's interested. I also wrote it for professors looking to teach Introduction to South Asian History, whether you do that in 1 or 2 semesters at your university. And as someone who does this, I teach History of South Asia 1 or 2 every semester at Rutgers Newark. These poems teach extremely well. Students love them. So with all that in mind, I chose the Therigatha, right? Why not focus on that? In terms of caste, I was trying to do 2 things there. One is I do make a concerted effort at various points in the book to trace the history of caste as a concept and as a social practice and reality in South Asia. Those are not the same, by the way. Caste is a theory and caste is a reality. Caste as a theory has been around a lot longer, and that is really that's part of Brahminical history, really. Like caste is a Brahminical idea. It's articulated, especially by male Brahmin authors. It has a lot to do with sexism as well. Gender and caste are deeply tied. And so I trace the history of those ideas. That's some of the harshest pages in the book, some of the hardest for me to write. I also want to trace the history of caste as an actual social practice. So I quote from sources, especially traveler sources, starting in the mid-1st millennium CE that talk about untouchability. These are folks who came, especially from China. They saw untouchability in India and they write about it. It's very clear. So I give some of the primary sources on that. I talk about when endogamy, marriage within caste groups, started. That's actually a case where genetic evidence has been very strong and useful in South Asian history. Began about 1900 years ago, all right? And then I trace this all the way through to modern times. So this is tracing the history of oppression. I try to center the views of the caste oppressed rather than the oppressors. That does sometimes lead me to be a bit speculative. Now, speculative is not a term historians like, right? But at some point, when you have source after source after source, and they're all written by the dominant group in any kind of social hierarchy situation, one sort of tool historians have is to read against the grain, okay? And to use the text to flip the perspective. And that is something that I do. So as opposed to talking about what it looks like from an oppressor standpoint, a little bit imagining, but in a concrete way, what that might have looked like and felt like from the oppressed standpoint. I think a final thing I'll mention that I do in the book it concerns just sort of like elites versus non-elites generally. I include plenty of elite people in the book. I talk about the big kings, all that sort of stuff. They matter. Elites matter. I have a whole chapter on Ashoka, more or less, for example, right? Big guy. But I also talk about like everyday people in the Mauryan Empire. I talk, right, in the 3rd century BCE, I talk about the people that he enslaved at Kalinga and what we know about them. Fast forwarding is the last example I'll give here to the end of the book. So the last two chapters are on modern times, post-independence, South Asia. The penultimate chapter, the second to last, is largely focused on politics. Right, I cover a bunch of different sort of modern issues, everything from Sri Lanka's civil war to Operation Blue Star in India, to Islamization in Pakistan under Zia, all that sort of stuff. So it's a lot of politics, a lot of sort of kind of bird's eye view perspective. Then in the last chapter, I don't do much politics, right? The last chapter, which is really on the first 2 decades, more or less, of the 21st century, going to about 2020, I focus on everyday people more and stuff that affects us all. I talk about growing wealth inequality in India. I talk about the conditions of urban life. I talk about climate change, which disproportionately impacts the poor. I even have a little bit on truck art in Pakistan. Right. So, public art, it matters. People put their money into this. People care about it. It's something that's very visible. Right. So, I do that for a bunch of reasons, but this is a sort of tactic I use throughout the book. If I focus on the politics and the elite, or I focus on the men, or I focus on the upper caste in one chapter or in one section, well, maybe in the next, I focus on women or on the lower castes or on everyday people like us.
Very interesting. And as you're talking about caste, I also know that recently at your university, you've been part of this whole conversation around caste as well. And it's gained a bit of media attention, and of course, in the activist circles, there is a lot of conversation around that. And I found it interesting that it's almost like you're drawing that string from way back when right into your present here and now, and you're able to see it actually through a very different lens than most people. Talk to me a little bit, if we can digress, to what is the conversation now in an American campus on caste?
Oh, absolutely. I think in general in the American Academy over the last several decades, many of us, the bulk of us, have been trying to move towards greater equity, greater inclusion. I know we're having a big political hiccup on that front in America right now. But I mean, the sentiment on campus, I think, remains the same. And so we've had a lot of conversations in the last couple of decades about racial equity, about gender equity, about being LGBTQ plus inclusive, trans inclusive. And so caste is just part of that broader conversation, whether you want to call it diversity or DEI or just like making it an equal playing field for everyone, however you want to view it. For me, it's part of the best of what America is supposed to be, right? And what we as Americans want to strive to be, at least many of us. And so, the adding of caste to university discrimination policies, this has largely been a matter of clarity in the US. There are many caste systems in the world. When we've been talking about caste, we've been talking about caste in South Asia specifically. That's what I do 99% of the time, hazard of, what I focus. But there are actually a bunch of different caste systems in the world. And, in Oaxaca in Mexico, they've got one. There's a bunch of different ones in operation in parts of Africa, so on and so forth. So when we talk about caste on an American campus, it's not South Asian caste specifically. It's all kinds of caste systems. Caste has not historically been a huge part of American life, right? Like going back to the beginning and the founding of the Republic and in the 18th century and all of that. And so as a result, most of our anti-discrimination policies list a ton of stuff and caste just isn't on the list. And so it's unclear. Is it included? Is it not, right? So it could be included under national origin, under race, under religion, maybe. There's various ways, but it's just not certain. And so to me, the movement to add caste in one way or another to university anti-discrimination policies, it's a way for universities to, one, say casteism is a problem and say caste-based discrimination is not welcome. And two, just to clarify that, yes, actually, if you report it, we will take it seriously. Right. And so at Rutgers, we had a movement to add it and it worked in the end. We did it in this, our administration did it in a slightly roundabout way through binding interpretive guidance as opposed to adding the word to the policy. The effect is the same. Caste-based discrimination is now barred explicitly for the first time at Rutgers University, right? This is a university that's over 200 years old. So that's a pretty big deal to me.
And I think this, what you said about it being explicit, holds a lot of meaning, because what you say out loud and what you can see almost on paper, you can actually address and have more conversations around. So that's, I think it's a
Absolutely.
really big sort of landmark move, really. And perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps, it opens the door for other institutions to also consider including caste in their anti-discrimination frameworks and laws. So this definitely,
I certainly hope so. We've got a few dozen colleges and universities
yes.
that have added caste in one way or another in the U.S. And hopefully many more will follow. Ultimately, hopefully we have federal legislation on the point, right? And then it's just clear
At
for
the
everyone.
moment, I think, it's a big wait and watch game for everybody who's looking at America right now. There seems to be more
Yeah,
changes.
possibly not with this administration. We, we'll play the
Maybe
long game, maybe on
we might
that.
have to wait a little bit. All right. I do want to shift gears again and go back to the past, right? You did, I think you edited the book, or perhaps you were involved in the book itself, which is the Ramayana of Hamida Banu Begum, which is
Oh, yeah.
right? So,
Mhm.
who was the wife of Humayun, mother of Akbar, and there's a Ramayana that was found in her library, so to speak, and now is in Doha in a museum. It was quite fascinating to read about that and to know that there was this whole exchange of culture in some way, where Sanskrit scholars and pundits were in a Mughal court, and they were actually sitting with Persian translators, and they were actually going through this process of uh, taking Sanskrit texts and translating them into Persian. So you call them the cultural encounters in the court. And it was very interesting to see that, even though, I mean, the dynamic between the ruled and subjects will always remain as the underlying basis, I suppose. But even so, there was far more ease, perhaps, and far more exchange than what contemporary narratives around the Delhi Sultanate and around the Mughal rule allow. And I'd like to just ask you a question on that if we were to look at it through that different lens and to understand that it wasn't only a binary sort of way of looking at the ruler and the subject and subjugation and oppression, that there were nuanced exchanges as well. How does that change the narrative? How does that change the story, especially for those who will say that essentially, um, you know, we were victimized, and there needs to be some sort of a correction of that. How do you view that in that context?
Thank you. That's a wonderful and nuanced question. So I think one of the starting points is probably to consider, right? Like you say, how does this counter the narrative or address the narrative? Like we were oppressed by the rulers. Like who's the we and who's the rulers, right? So that is one great place to start. So let me take the example of Akbar. Right, Akbar oversaw, he ordered the initial translation of the Ramayana, for example, from Sanskrit into Persian. Also, one of the major Mughal kings, one of the more well-known figures in Indian history overall. I mean, Akbar was the head of the empire, but by himself, he would have accomplished bupkis in life, right? So yes, he's the ruler, he's the king. That matters, but he is reliant, and he was reliant on a huge number of people, both elites and non-elites, to help him build and maintain his empire. So in the India 5,000 Years of History book, I talk about this, right? And for elites, I talk about Rajputs. Many scholars refer not to Mughal culture, but to Mughal Rajput culture with a dash, like Mughal dash Rajput culture. And I like that. It sort of fell away. Like we used to do that decades ago, and it sort of fell away. I kind of think we should resuscitate that little bit. Because Rajputs were foundational to the state, and they weren't all the same. right? I mean, the Kachwaha lineage, like they were in from day one. Okay, they were like, sign me up for the Mughal Mansabdar system. We're all in. I mean, it was Bharmal. It was his idea to marry his daughter to Akbar, right? Like the Mughals somehow like get blamed for this. Like this was a Rajput
Yes.
idea, not a Mughal idea. Now Akbar liked it. He like saw the political benefit and kept doing that. In contrast, the Sisodias, I mean, from a Mughal perspective, they were a major pain, right? Like they kept resisting. There were multiple military confrontations, and even after they were brought into the fold, like any possibility to rebel, they were like on that train. So different Rajput lineages had different, approaches, but overall, the Rajputs built the Mughal state, right? Without them, it would be completely different. So, are they part of the we that was oppressed? Absolutely not. They were part of the rulers, right? And then I also, in the same chapter, after I talk about Rajputs, I talk about laborers. Right? When we talk about building an empire, it matters what happens on the battlefield. Of course, you have to control territory, but it also matters like who actually builds stuff, like the physical stuff, right? So I got thinking about that, like who's actually building all these buildings? You wander around northern India today, I mean, the built landscape that's sort of left over from the Mughals is highly visible, especially in places like Delhi and Agra. And so, like, who actually built this stuff? Like, obviously, Akbar's not laying bricks, right? We know a certain amount about the laborers. One thing we know is a lot of them were Hindu. So when you go to Fatehpur Sikri, majority of people who built that were Hindus. Go to the Taj Mahal, majority of those builders were Hindus as well. Those folks built the state in a certain way. They're part of the imperial project as well. I think another thing I would say, another way to approach this is that usually when people want to go in for a sort of, the big bad Mughals or big bad Muslim rulers narrative, it breaks on religious lines, right? What they're concerned with is the idea that Muslims were oppressing Hindus. This is a modern concern. It's a modern framing. If you ever wonder where you got that idea, the answer is the British, right? You are still repeating British colonial era propaganda. But the British may be long gone from South Asia. That bit has lived on. One way to complicate that by looking at the past is just to think about whether those categories work, right? Did the Mughals really act predominantly as Muslims? I mean, is that really how they ran their empire? I would argue no. They're not doing anything, for the most part, identifiably sort of Islamic in a narrow sense. They're not enacting Sharia or anything like that. Complicating the identity of Hindu is even more straightforward. The term was not used at the time very widely, especially self-referentially, right? Hindu was an imposed term by others. It wasn't adopted by Hindus widely until a bit later. In Hindu communities, I mean, there weren't very many policies that sort of targeted Hindus or were about Hindus as a collective. Hindus fared very differently under both the Delhi Sultanates and the Mughals, depending on who they were in their own terms. Were they Brahmins? Were they Rajputs? Where were they from? Did they collaborate with the state? Did they not? So on and so forth.
Again,
one thing I'll mention, sorry?
Just listening to you talk about that, again, we are back to the Panchatantra. There is no one story. There are many different
Absolutely not.
There are many different Hindus.
No, absolutely. So one thing I'll just mention just very briefly, because you brought it up for Hamidu Banu Begum's Ramayana, her Persian copy of the Ramayana. So when Akbar originally ordered the Ramayana translated from Sanskrit into Persian, in my view, and I've argued this in prior publications, he was aiming at a Mughal audience. Right? Mm-hmm. He meant this predominantly for Mughal readers, majority of whom were Muslim. Okay, and this is evidenced, for example, by one of the major illustrated Ramayanas being in Hamidu Banu's collection, right? However, over the next several decades after the Ramayana was translated, a ton of Hindus learned Persian. Okay, and this was in order to enter Mughal service. Akbar made Persian the mandatory language of Mughal service in 1582. After that, if you wanted to work for the Mughals, you had to learn Persian. So a significant number of especially upper class and upper caste Hindus started going to madrasas and learning Persian. By the sometime in the 18th century, I would guess, more Hindus knew Persian than Sanskrit. right? That's not that surprising. Like Sanskrit had never been a particularly common language, even among Hindus. It had always been restricted to elites of a certain caste. But one thing it meant is when folks are thinking about, okay, well, like, how do I access Ramayana? How do I read the Bhagavad Gita? They're not looking to the Sanskrit because they can't read that, but they do look to the, by that point, numerous Persian versions of both of those texts and many others, the Bhagavata Purana, so on and so forth. There's a ton of Hindu texts that get rendered into Persian. And so you end up with more Hindu readers of these Persian
That's
sources
fast.
than anybody else.
That's such an interesting, I didn't know that. And I think a lot of people wouldn't have known that, but that's interesting to know. And the other thing is that when you sort of say that, they obviously we've all seen images of temples, for instance, where the idols are defaced or the noses are cut off. And, and
Although I would caution, right? Noses like fall off and get hit off a lot.
that's true.
That does not prove that it was deliberate. Just a word of
Right.
warning.
Right. No, I'm sure there are natural causes as well, but maybe
Right. It's
this,
sort of like when you go to an art museum and like a lot of like the old statues from Rome and Greece are missing the heads.
yes,
Like it's just a weak point. Anyways.
yes, so it's fallen off. But the point that I was trying to make was that I would think that that was sort of par for the course with any conquering army or any sort of any king or any ruler who was, whether Hindu or Muslim or whatever it is, was doing the same thing. And violence was, or political violence, uh, as we see today, is not something really confined to any one religious group. And for instance, that you do talk about the Magad Empire, where Bimbisara was killed by Ajatashatru, who was his son. And then, of course, we know about the Marathas and the exploits in Bengal. So, and pre-Buddhism Ashoka was not really the most benign ruler that you could have known. So, known for violence, really. And so, this is something that does change the story a little bit when you look at it in a broader context of how kingdoms expand and how kings wage war. And then to your point that the Mughals had a sort of a different uh, way of empire building, which included this sort of cultural exchange and really getting some of the Hindu scriptures or texts translated into Persian. And that's something that's not very widely known. But there has been a lot of talk about your retelling of Aurangzeb's story. Why did you find that particularly interesting?
Oh gosh. Okay, so let me first say I agree entirely. Pre-modernity is extraordinarily violent. That's like a general truism. Folks, there's a lot of killing, right, in pre-modern sources. In case folks are worried, right, I do talk about that with the Mughals too. I have a whole bit on Chittor, which they have this kind of shock and awe strategy of not only this brutal fort siege, but then killing a few 10,000, maybe 20,000 roughly, if I recall correctly, civilians afterwards. So I talk about it for everyone. In terms of Aurangzeb, so I wrote a whole biography of the guy. I include a bit about him, of course, in the India 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent book as well. And how could I not? He was the most successful, most powerful king in South Asian history by a long shot, right? He ruled the most territory by a long shot. Like nobody comes even close. If you think Ashoka came close, you're wrong. Anyways, I originally wrote a biography of Aurangzeb back in 2017, when that was the publication date, because I felt that book was aimed at a popular audience, not aimed predominantly at an academic audience. And I felt at the time, and I think I was right, that basically he was the most incorrectly understood in the popular realm of the Mughal kings. Basically, we had like 50 years of scholarly advances on how to think about Aurangzeb Alamgir within the academy. We're all on board. All historians were on board. And no one had really translated that to popular readers. And so there was just this growing disconnect. Aurangzeb looked one way over here for scholars and a totally different way over here for everyone else. Historians, our only job is not to explain what we do to everyone else, but that is part of the discipline, okay? And it's a part of the discipline I like, so I thought I'd try my hand at it. I think it was successful, even if many people didn't like the success. I still, people talk more about the hate mail I get, but I do get fan mail. I still get fan mail about Aurangzeb. Always appreciate it when folks send me notes about how they liked it. It's always really nice. Thank you to all those folks who have ever sent me an email or even a snail mail letter occasionally on that point. I think one of the challenges I faced in my new book, the India book, coming out with Aurangzeb, was sort of how to deal with him in a way that didn't sort of focus on him so much.
Mm.
When I wrote the biography, I did write it as a biography of Aurangzeb. So of course I focused on him, and that is what it is. I think I had some thoughts lately in the book about writing biography, but I just sort of went with that. But I do think a focus on the kings alone, this is not a good way to do history, and it's a tendency that has especially marred Mughal studies, and one that I have arguably participated in. I do in this book, I do have a section where I more or less talk about Aurangzeb, but it's not a whole chapter. It's just one section. Then I have a section where I talk about his policies and their impact on different groups of people, including different groups of Hindus within his empire, right? So as opposed to talking about him, I talk about the people his policies impacted. And my argument for that is really that that's why we care about him. Insofar as he's just one guy from the 17th century, of course I care about all people from the 17th century, but insofar as he's just one guy, whatever, right? We care about him because of the power he wielded and the way that he shaped Indian society at his time. So why not focus on the society, right? I then spend the second half of that chapter, if memory serves, talking about Marathas and talking about Shivaji and other Marathas as well, and sort of what that world looked like.
The way that we were taught when we were in school about Aurangzeb was completely unidimensional, right? Fanatical ruler, religious, dictator. And we didn't really understand more beyond that because, this is how the textbooks were written then. So I think it's always good to have an alternate narrative. And you've said this book is going to be in India as well, the book that is going to come out now. And I'm sure you'll get a lot of conversation around that as well. Talk to me a little bit about the empire, the British rule of India, and how you think that fundamentally changed some of the ways in which we now think about India pre the British and the impact that it's had on the way we think of ourselves, or at least the way that we are being written about post-colonization.
That's a great question. So I think when I moved into the sort of the British colonization periods of the book, I faced an immediate issue, which is so often in South Asian history, right? When you're doing a kind of overview thing, you're reading along and it's about India, it's about Indians, right? You're talking about Ashoka, you're talking about the Cholas, you're talking about Vijayanagara, the Mughals, all these people. And then suddenly you hit British colonization and it's all British names. Right, you're talking about Mackenzie and Sir William Jones. Why do we include the Sir? I do not include the Sir. He's just William Jones. I don't care that the man was knighted. Right, that's not relevant to me. So the narrative totally shifts, and Indians basically disappear, or they become a peoples and a society on whom and to whom things are done. And actions are foisted, and they are no longer actors in their own story. And I have a real serious problem with that. I think that it is, I think at worst, it's dehumanizing. At best, it takes away Indian agency. And I'm not on board with either of those agendas. So I do tell the story of British colonialism from an Indian perspective. And I have a lengthy footnote on this. I think there is a way to tell it from a British perspective, right? It is part of British history. And I leave that issue for British historians, who really should do a better job dealing with it. But as for me, I'm not a European historian. I'm a South Asia historian. So I do it from a South Asia perspective. So I do forefront Indians, even throughout that story. I talk about Indian agency throughout British colonialism, both those who helped the British colonial project, and a lot of Indians did, and those who opposed it. And a lot of Indians did that too. A certain number did both. in different ways and at different times. You did have a lot like folks going back and forth as per their interests. My general interest remains the same in those sections, which is to explain why people made the choices they did, right? Because from a modern perspective, I think it's easy to look back and be like, British colonialization was terrible for India. Why would any Indian have helped with that? That's not a helpful stance, right? And so I try to explain the incentives at the time and why actors may have made very reasonable choices to support the British in a particular time and place. And then, of course, I want to see how it changed Indian society. In terms of how Indians viewed themselves and those legacies, a lot of that has to do with the intellectual history of British colonialism. And I talk about that. I talk about the early Orientalists. I talk about the works that they claim to have translated. Really, it was usually pundits who translated it. And I do note that, right? Like we always talk about Halhed is writing the Code of Gentoo Laws. Like a bunch of pundits actually wrote that stuff, right? I mean, maybe Halhed contributed a little bit, but, I do note that. Just because he put his name on the title page doesn't really speak to true agency. One thing I do that is different than many historians. So the British in the 18th and 19th centuries especially, they came up with a lot of ideas about South Asian history. And that remains, in a sense, the intellectual foundation for us today, even as we've moved very far from that. Most historians who do overview histories, they mention those British theories when they talk about the subject on which they focus, right? Mm-hmm. So if the British theory is that the Mughals were big bad Muslim conquerors, most historians will mention that when they talk about the Mughals and say, well, we don't think that anymore. Here's what we think instead. Mm-hmm. I do not do this. And I do not do this because in my experience of teaching, it doesn't work. Students remember the bad theory better, right? And usually it's more narratively easy and attractive than they remember the good theory. And also not everyone actually knows, especially in America where I teach and live, not everyone knows the bad theories. So why are we introducing them? So what I do, I don't mention any of this stuff when I'm going through pre-modern South Asian history, and I put it all in the colonialism chapters. That's when I talk about it, when it comes up in history, not when the subject on which it focuses comes up in history. And so I think that's appropriate. It also, it limits the influence of these theories, right? I am able and I do recognize them and their power later, but I don't project their power earlier. And to me, that is part of overcoming them. Obviously, my book alone is not going to get us out of thinking about, Hindu versus Muslim all the time, all right? But if we are ever going to have an intellectual way to move beyond that, we have to stop talking about it all the time. And we have to just offer better narratives and better stories. And that's what I'm trying to do in the rest of the book before the colonialism parts.
I think, there will be a lot of conversation, I think, around that, particularly because I find now a very interesting development, which is when the proponents of Hindutva speak about, secularism or the left, they tend to say that you're colonized and you're still colonized and you're not thinking about the glory of the Hindus prior to British rule. And, so to them, the idea of being decolonized is to adopt Hindutva, which to them is the essence of who we should be. And I find that quite interesting because firstly, it doesn't ring true to me at all. And secondly, I think it just oversimplifies and creates this false narrative of what it means to be decolonized. What is your understanding of that?
Yeah, so I actually have a very clear and direct response to that. One, for the Hindutva proponents who say that, you are projecting. It's all projection. Modern Hindu nationalists are the major inheritors of British colonial intellectual thought. They're the ones that are repeating the colonization tropes. The whole Hindu glory days, y'all didn't come up with that. The British came up with that. So far as taking pride in ancient India and in, the Hindu past, I'm not a big fan of that language of the Hindu past and Hindu history, but from where I stand, it looks to me like they're the ones ashamed. I'm the one that's telling the true story and saying, look at it in all its horror and all its glory. If they're serious about taking pride in ancient India, then take pride in ancient India. Don't make up your own version. When you make up your own version, you're denying the truth. That's the opposite of pride. That's shame.
And it also should come with some level of accountability. I mean, you cannot talk about Hindu pride and not look at the big elephant in the room, which is the caste system. There's no point talking about Hindu pride if we don't address that, even from within, first from within. And of course, from an objective standpoint, which you're coming in with, it's amply clear that while there are glorious and beautiful things, there is all of this ugliness as well that has to be addressed and at least spoken about truthfully. So I do commend you, in spite of all the hate that you get, that you do speak about certain things that are difficult to maybe listen to or internalize, but it's important work. I want to ask you, now that we've spoken a lot about what's happened in the past, in the present, we're going through big changes. There are big movements. There are things that are dying. A new world seems to be born every day almost with the news cycle that kind of, whether we're talking about Gaza, whether we're talking about what's happening in the US or Europe. As a historian, what might future historians make of the times that we're living in?
Oh, goodness. Probably little good. I mean, I don't think we're at a great moment with the rise of the global far right. I don't think that's going to be looked on kindly in the future. I will say, in terms of the India history book, the main way in which I had to deal with this was how to write about Hindu nationalism. Right? It's a huge storyline in modern South Asia. It shapes all of our minds and all of our worlds right now. It's also only 100 years old. Right? Like Hindutva is, 100, maybe 120 years old if you really want to stretch it, right? But, it's so new when you're writing 5,000 years of history, right? Like it only comes up at the very end. But even that, so I mean, writing the early history of Hindu nationalism, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. The Nazi stuff, the Mussolini stuff, it's, European fascism basically imported to South Asia, right? So another sort of imported thing that comes from somewhere else, right? I mean, Godse killing Gandhi, that's all relatively straightforward. Once you get to about 1980, you start to have the BJP and you start to have Hindu nationalism rise from a minor, no respectable Indian wants to touch this steaming pile philosophy to this, 2 or 3 decade trek to becoming the dominant, political ideology of modern day Indians. That story was much harder for me to tell and narrate because we don't have historical distance, right? We're too close. And I know we have many historians that work on contemporary stuff. I know there's ways to do it, but as a historian who is generally focused on history and societies and people that are long gone, this is outside of my comfort zone. One thing that I was clear I wanted to avoid was overemphasizing Hindu nationalism. And that might sound a little strange, right? Especially for those of you who are living in modern day India. It's like, how could you overemphasize this? Like, this is life right now. But you have to underscore the right now, right? And I simply don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with Hindu nationalism, especially I don't know when, right? Hindutva will fall apart someday, and I say that in the book. Historians don't make predictions very much, but I do make that one. Fascism wears itself out, usually relatively fast, but relatively fast could be next year, and it could be 20 years, and it could be more, right? Like, relatively fast in terms of like the historian's time scale, not like your life's time scale. That is cold comfort to those who are living with, especially under the direct effects of Hindu nationalism and experiencing its horrors and hate and disempowerment. But from a historian's standpoint of trying to write about this, one thing I did was I didn't end with Hindu nationalism. I didn't give it the last word, right? It's not the end of the book, which is how many people have done it, right? Your sort of final chapter is on kind of the rise of far-right politics in modern day India. And I didn't do it that way. I ended with climate change, because that is something I am much more certain will be a huge shaping force to all of South Asia, not just India, and to all communities in South Asia for at least the next 100 years.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in the immediacy of the political turmoil that people go through. So thank you for that. Thank you for bringing focus back to the important things and keeping the important things in the center of the conversation. This is going to be a great book to get in the hands of people, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of conversation around this. I'm glad I got a chance to sort of speak with you and also go through the book before it comes out. And I wish you the very best and hope we get a chance to speak again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nandini. It was my pleasure.